Hey, it's Drew. And guess what? This is part one of a two-part interview I did with novelist Chris Bohjalian. Our discussion was just so interesting and fascinating and amazing that we just kept going. So this is part one, and stay tuned in a couple days for part two, and thanks for listening.
Welcome to Renegade Thinkers Unite, a show that will help you transform your marketing from mere messaging to programs that break the rules and make a difference. Join the movement today and learn non-traditional techniques that give you an edge. Now, here's your Chief Marketing Renegade, Drew Nizer.
In our continuing effort to bring you fresh takes on marketing, today's guest is not a marketer by profession. In fact, he's a novelist, but long before his fifth book, Midwives, spent a year or so on the New York Times bestseller list. He was a freshly minted Amherst grad working as an assistant account executive at J. Walter Thompson for yours truly on the prized Listerine business. And I say that may surprise you, but packaged goods were a big deal, and we were on the biggest business in the Warner Lambert group. And though that was 3 decades ago, there are several things I need to tell you about my working experience with Chris Bohjalian, who is the guest, of course, today. And first, when Chris worked for me, he was so darn efficient, I could never give him enough to do. And it got to the point, and this is a true story, that my boss asked me, "So Drew, what are you doing these days since Chris does all your work?" So that's the first. The second is that every day, Chris spent 2 hours. He got up way before the rest of us and got 2 hours of writing done before any of us had gotten into the office. And he managed to get several short stories published in prestigious magazines while the rest of the account team were sleeping off our extra margaritas. And the third thing I want to tell you is that one day, Chris came into my office and told me a story about a harrowing experience he and his investment banker wife, Victoria, had, and that they had decided to chuck it all and move to Vermont to pursue artistic careers. He is a writer and she is a photographer. It all sounded a bit crazy to me, so at the time, I lamely tried to talk him out of walking away from a promising career as an ad man. So welcome to the show, Chris. Welcome to Renegade Thinkers Unite. And I know that all of your fans thank you for not listening to me way back then.
Drew, I have the fondest memories of working for you at J. Walter Thompson. And as a matter of fact, I learned so much from you, including one mantra. You taught me this, and I do not think a week goes by when I do not quote you. The world would be such a better place if everyone could say this. I was wrong before. I'm smarter now.
Well, see, and I did it in this episode. I already admitted I was wrong about trying to talk you out of what turned to be an amazing career. And I want to take people back because this was a moment. Not everyone has a life-changing incident like you and Victoria had. And I'm not talking about working for me. Maybe you could share what triggered your escape from New York. Take us back to that moment.
Sure. Victoria and I were living in Brooklyn at the time, and we had just gone to a party on East 8th Street in Manhattan. And it was a Friday night, and we hailed a cab. And as anyone who ever watched Sex and the City knows, cab drivers hated to go to the outer boroughs back then because there was no return fare. So we got in the cab, said we were going to Brooklyn, and the cab driver was really angry and was speeding on the FDR Drive, going so quickly that he actually got pulled over by one of New York's finest. And you have to be driving NASCAR speeds to get pulled over on the FDR Drive on a Friday night. And here's where I changed my life forever. I said to the cab driver, "Excuse me, sir, why don't you turn off your meter while you're getting your ticket?" And he did, but he was really angry now. After the police officer had driven away, he proceeded to take my wife and me on a 45-minute joyride, ignoring all traffic lights in Lower Manhattan. He didn't even get on the Brooklyn Bridge. He literally exited in Lower Manhattan. And before I knew it, we were in the South Bronx, and he comes to a stop. My wife and I decided if he ever comes to a stop, we bolt out of the cab. And so we did. And then we understood why he'd come to a stop. There was a police officer at the corner. So as the cabbie was driving away, I said to the police officer, "Excuse me, sir, there's an extremely discourteous cab driver pulling away." The police officer said, get down now." So we did. And then we understood the police officer's passion. There were 3 guys spread eagle against this tenement building with yellow tower record bags overflowing with guns and drug paraphernalia. They just stormed a crack house. So my wife, who'd grown up in Manhattan, said, "Why do we live here?" And I said, "I don't know." And the next day, the New York Times travel section had an article on the People's Republic of Burlington, Vermont, the Bernie Sanders Burlington. And so we flew up because at the time, People Express was flying to Burlington for $19 a seat. And we fell in love with Vermont. Now, whenever I tell this story, I think it's important to note that I do love New York City. I do. I'm still in New York City all the time. My wife and I have a place in Murray Hill. But at that point in our lives, it was important for us to have an excuse to go downwardly mobile. Victoria was working on the 104th floor of Two World Trade and Investment Banking, as you said. I was having a great time working for you at J. Walter Thompson, but we were definitely on this yuppie up escalator. And if we didn't go downwardly mobile now, I'm not sure that I ever would have been able to make the sacrifices to become a novelist, or my wife would have been able to make the sacrifices to become the fine art photographer that she is.
So it's an incredible story. And of course, it sounds like something that you, showed up in, you wrote for one of your novels, but it happens to be true. So you moved to Vermont. That was in 87, and you kept working part-time in the ad business. Which of course you've now told me that has no impact on your writing style. So it's now 1997 and you get a phone call, that further changed your life. Talk about that. I love I've told people that story a million times, but I'd much rather hear it from you and make sure I got it right.
You do essentially have it right, but it wasn't 1997. It was October 18th, 1998. Midwives, the novel, was published in hardcover in March of 1997. It was published in paperback in July of 1998 and became a bestseller. On October 18th, the phone call I got was from Oprah Winfrey, telling me that Midwives was her next selection. And I remember the moment really quite vividly. My daughter was in kindergarten at the time, and she'd just come home from school. She had one of her friends with her. There were 2 guys in the basement seeing if they could get 1 more year out of my furnace, which I'm not kidding, was from the Eisenhower administration. The papers were 1959. And I don't remember this part of the conversation, but Oprah would tell me later that apparently I said something along the lines of, well, I'm so honored to be on the selection committee. And she said, "There's no committee. I'm the committee. You're the book." And the thing I remember most, though, isn't that phone call. But about a week and a half later, she holds up the book on her show and says, "For our next book, we're going to Vermont." And all of a sudden, you are absolutely beleaguered by media. And it's lovely and it's wonderful. But one of the weird footnotes to this is I get a call from a writer for the Associated Press who wants to know how much money I think I'm going to make from this unbelievable blessing. And I said, I'd really prefer to talk about the text and what this means just for storytelling and why Oprah's book club is such a great gift to the world. And she said, "Okay, so where were you when Oprah called?" And I said, "Well, I was home and there were a couple guys in the basement seeing if they could get 1 more year out of my furnace." And she said, "Well, I'll bet you can afford a new furnace now." And I said, "Well, yes, but I could have afforded a new furnace yesterday too." So my dad calls the next day, and my dad always used to call me Chrissy. And he says, "Chrissy, is everything okay?" And I said, sure, Dad, why? He said, Chrissy, do you need money? I said, no, why in the name of heavens would you think I need money? And he said, I'm looking at a newspaper article. Vermont writer can finally afford furnace.
Oh, well, yes, the media, they had an opportunity. Now, I was remembering though, when Oprah called you, you answer the phone and she says, hi, this is Oprah Winfrey. And you say, yeah, right. And then, and she said, no, this is really Oprah.
That's all
I want to talk to Chris. And you say, well, this is Chris. And she goes, yeah, right. Because she was expecting a female on the line. Is that a true story, or did I just make that completely up?
No, that's partly true and partly hyperbole. Essentially what had happened was I'd been on a 2-week book tour for the Midwives paperback, and I just returned to Vermont, and I went to the gym, and my wife got a phone call from somebody who said they represented an obscure book festival in Lake Forest, Illinois. Was this the home of the writer Chris Bohjalian? And my wife said, it is. This is his wife, Victoria. And they said, well, can we speak to him? And she said, no, he's at the gym, but he can call you back. And they said, no. My boss wants to talk to him, so she'll call back. So I get back from the gym, and Victoria now goes to the gym. But before she leaves, she says, now, you're about to get a phone call from an obscure book festival in Lake Forest, Illinois. Be polite. And I said, I'm always polite. And she said, no, you just returned from a 2-week book tour. Be polite. So she then leaves, and somebody calls, and it's a woman doing what seems to me a spectacular imitation of Oprah Winfrey. And I went along with this charade for a couple of minutes until finally said, okay, who's this really? It's clearly not Oprah. And she said, no, it's me. It's really me. I'm assuming this is really Chris. But I don't think Oprah at that point thought I was a woman. A lot of readers still think I'm a woman, which is the greatest compliment imaginable given my books. But I think Oprah had been briefed. I was pretty sure she was going to be getting a balding middle-aged man on the phone.
All right. Well, so I just added a little to that thing. So before we wrap up this segment, I mean, you are among the most disciplined human beings I've ever met, and your success was anything but a surprise to those of us who knew you. And before, Midwives made you, quote, an overnight sensation. Can you just talk a little bit about your writing routine?
I can. And you're right, it is disciplined. And in some ways, it goes back to all of the sorts of things that you taught me. Being precise, being careful, being thoughtful, being responsible, really trying to understand what you want to say, whether it's a call report about Listerine antiseptic or some marketing research on Claret's, the breath deodorant. I was writing between 5 and 7 a.m. in the morning before going to work at Thomson, and then Monday and Tuesday nights when I came home from work. When I left advertising once and for all in my early 30s, I continued to start writing at about 5 in the morning because that was my habit. And then we had an infant baby girl, and it was important to get as much writing in as I could before it was time to help get her up and out the door to daycare, and then to preschool, and then to elementary school. These days, I don't start at 5 in the morning anymore. I probably start about 6. But I'm at my desk until at least 11 or 11:30, often till noon or 12:30. The goal is to write 1,000 words a day. I don't always write 1,000 words, but as Jodi Picoult's observed, it is a whole lot easier to edit garbage than a blank page. And so it's important to get something down on paper. Every 50 or so pages, I print out what I have, and then I edit by hand using a fountain pen, because fountain pens are messy, and it forces me to think more slowly, to really find that right synonym for red, whether it's burgundy or claret. And I always also write with the understanding that the first draft isn't the final draft. My books will usually go through 7 or 8 or 9 drafts. I never know where I never know where my books are going. I depend on my characters to take me by the hand and lead me through the dark of the story.
It's a great place for us to just take a quick break. And then when we come back, we're going to jump into storytelling. This has been a term that is used, misused, misunderstood as far as I'm concerned by marketers. We're going to talk to a professional storyteller about storytelling. So we'll be right back.
Hey, it's Drew. I wanted to use this break to ask you a single question. Are you a courageous marketer? Do you have the courage to go to your board of directors and say marketing could drive the growth of this company? We just need 3 times the budget. Do you have the courage to take the big idea that you already have and extend it internally and externally through influencers, through the media, through all of your content? If you're a courageous marketer but aren't sure how to roadmap all of this, I have a big idea for you. It's called Renegade Thinking. It's a program that we've developed and work with exclusively for B2B marketers, generally at large companies. And I want to give you my cell phone, 917-679-8852. Just text Renegade Thinking to 917-679-8852, and we can talk about how you can cut through.
Okay, we're back, and my guest today is, my amazing guest today, and my good friend guest today is Chris Bohjalian, the novelist. And Chris, before we jump into storytelling, and I have to sort of mention, because it's a fun thing to do, when you and I were at JWT, there was another promising writer who also was working before normal business hours. But you two sort of took very different approaches in your novels. Of course, I'm talking about James Patterson. It's just sort of amazing to me to think that the two of you were doing what you did and left the business eventually and went on to great success.
Yeah, here's another interesting footnote to my career. I wrote a first novel, and it is the single worst first novel ever published, bar none. I mean, there is no worse book than A Killing in the Real World, but much to my utter astonishment, St. Martin's wanted to publish it. And actually, in all fairness, I wasn't astonished at the time. I didn't realize how bad the book was. I
was looking at my bookshelf last night, and by the way, I have an autographed copy of Killing in the Real World, and it's a prized collection. So
it is worth way more money than anyone should ever pay for it. Not because it's any good, but because I think it sold about 7 copies. So you've got a real rarity. In any case, though, once I had this book contract, St. Martin's said, we need some blurbs for the back. Would you mind approaching some writers? And so I decided to man up and approach James Patterson. Now, at the time, I was an assistant account executive, and James was the creative director. In my memory, I'm in a cubicle the size of a Mini Cooper, and he's in a corner office the size of a putting green. And so I approached him and introduced myself and asked him if he'd be willing to read the manuscript. And he graciously said yes. And about 2 weeks later, he summoned me into his office and provided me with this beautiful blurb about how much he'd enjoyed the book and how he was excited for whatever I was going to write next. So the best part of A Killing in the Real World is actually the James Patterson blurb on the back. I think it's worth noting that there are a lot of reasons why James's books sell really well. But certainly 2 of the reasons are A, his deep respect for his readers and his understanding that he needs to be giving them something back. And secondly, his understanding of the notion of brand. His idea that James Patterson is a writer, but James Patterson is also a brand, and readers have very specific expectations of what they're going to get when they open one of his books.
So those are great points, and that's all we need to cover about Mr. Patterson. But, what's interesting to me, Chris, is that in many ways our worlds have collided in the last few years. Storytelling has jumped from the domain of novelists like yourself into brand marketing, and social media has sort of leapt from my world into your world of book selling. So let's start with storytelling. And I looked at a couple of your interviews recently, and you said, I think people read novels because they are emotionally invested in the characters or fascinated with the story. And a lot of us might argue the same goes for why consumers choose a brand or spend time with their content. Do you have any insights to bear on sort of storytelling from what you do and storytelling from what brands do?
Sure. First of all, I think novels are changing. And I believe they are changing because we are in the midst of a wonderful renaissance in television drama. The Sopranos, Mad Men, Breaking Bad, The Handmaid's Tale. Certainly, television drama at its finest impacts the way that I write today. And that gets to my second point. The digital world has changed our attention spans and our expectations. I think it's utterly fascinating when most of us think of Les Miserables, we think it begins with Jean Valjean stealing the candlesticks. That's how the musical begins. That's how the movie begins. The reality is that Jean Valjean steals the candlesticks on page 104 of my edition of the novel. The first 103 pages is a lengthy discussion of the goodness of the Archbishop. That novel has 60 pages about the sewers of Paris. Thanks to The Sopranos and Breaking Bad and Mad Men, we've got a very different craving for narrative drive and storytelling, which is why when my books work, and heaven knows they do not always work, they are in part about dread, and they are in part about a narrative drive that must begin from page 1. That doesn't mean that I don't want characters that are deep and real, because heaven knows that I do. But you want to meet those characters quickly. You want to feel their pain quickly and understand why you're going to be emotionally invested in that story quickly.
And it's really interesting. And obviously, I mean, marketers have faced this speed issue for a long time in that, in the days when we were producing 30-second commercials, we had very few seconds to get their attention. I'm sort of wondering where narrative and conflict, have you seen a brand that you think is a particularly good storyteller? I mean, I'm sort of looking for some insight, cause it's interesting. Dread is not necessarily a term you're going to hear a marketer use.
No, but last night I watched the Emmys, and the commercials that I remember most is one that isn't even aimed at me. And that was for Dove Real Beauty. And it was all about the beauty of different female body types. And every single woman in that 30-second commercial instantly conveyed a story and a sense of pride. And I was all in for every single one of them. Secondly, Audi. Audi took advantage of the emotional connections that anyone watching the Emmys has to TV and to TV history by having orchestral renditions of theme songs from the Mary Tyler Moore Show and some of the other Emmy winners of history's past. And whenever you hear the strains to You Might Just Make It After All, if you're of a certain demographic, you feel a wistful, beautiful, poignant pang, and you are more emotionally invested in that particular message.
I obviously I'm a big believer in the power of story, and I think a lot of brands get it wrong in that they think they need to be the hero of the story when they might be better served to be the sidekick or the wise sage.
That is so spot on. Wow, that is absolutely spot on.
And it's just interesting to me, and those examples that you gave are pretty good examples where they're not the hero, that the consumer is the hero or something. It's funny, you are very honest about not all of your novels having worked as well as you might have liked in retrospect. Are there some pitfalls in storytelling that you've sort of learned over the years that might have some application for brands?
When my books have artistically failed, it's usually because I lost courage. I'll give you a case in point, to be brutally honest about one of my books. It's called The Night Strangers, and it's about a pilot who isn't Sully Sullenberger, the pilot in a post-Sully era who has to ditch his regional jet in Lake Champlain after a double bird strike. But unlike Sully, his plane pinwheels and all but 9 of the passengers die on impact or drown in the roiling waters of Lake Champlain. It begins with what I think is a really good plane crash. I am really proud of the opening third of The Night Strangers. But then I lost confidence. I lost courage. And instead of focusing on one individual's PTSD and the ramifications for his family, for his spouse, for his children, I took one of those hard left-hand turns into the sensational. And I don't write the sensational. There are other writers who do it really, really well. But I don't think that's my specialty. And so I, wasn't sticking to my convictions, and B, I wasn't doing what I loved and what I think is my sweet spot, and the result is a book that, isn't among the top 5 in the 20 books I've written, that's for sure.
Well, I think those two things that you mention are very relevant to brands, and having the courage is really an important part. That's sort of a fundamental thing we talk about in Renegade Thinkers Unite. I mean, if you don't have courage, chances are you're not going to cut through. You're not going to get attention because you are going to be milquetoast. You're going to be like everybody else. So I think that's a good place for us to take a break. And when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit about how Chris approaches social media, which is very relevant to lots and lots of marketers out there. So hang in there. We've got lots more coming.
Hey, it's Drew. I was at a conference the other day and somebody looked at my saw lapel pen and said, "What's up with that?" And I said, well, what's the one thing that marketing has always had to do? Forget digital, forget all this stuff. What is the one marketing imperative? And he looked at me and went, "Cut through." And I went, "Yes, ding, 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 ding. That's right. Cut through. That is what marketing must do." And it's not just cutting through the clutter, although that's really important, because if your marketing doesn't cut through the clutter, it's like the proverbial tree in the forest that falls and nobody hears it. But it's also cutting through the crap and the processes that inhibit innovation. We've been working a lot lately with some CMOs to help them cut through the crap and get at the essence of what is their big idea. And how can they make a case to expand that idea across their business? That, to me, is cutting through.
Okay, we're back, and my guest is novelist Chris Bohjalian. And we talked a little bit about the storytelling and some of the pitfalls. And I had to, before we get to social media, I saw another interview quote where you said, when the author acknowledged that you'd, written a lot of books, I think it was 19 in the interview, said, you said, after they asked about you cranking them out, you said, "I like to believe that I have never cranked out anything. I like to believe that each book is the best I can do." And by the way, I argue this all the time that for content marketers, less is more, better. This is not about mass market. It is not about cranking crap out. It's about creating really good content that someone would actually want to read and maybe even be thirsty for more. So I don't even know if I have a question here, Chris, on that one. I just thought that was a great quote from you.
Well, I think there are 2 points worth addressing. That's a great question, and you're raising some great points. The first is about books, then the second is about social media. My readers, have very specific expectations for my work, and you can see that, I think, also in the social networks. And it comes back to authenticity. And I think that, and I should note that there are plenty of readers I know who love The Night Strangers and are really glad I wrote it. And I don't want to in any way diminish their enthusiasm for that book. I thank them greatly. But I don't normally write about that kind of things. And there was a level of inauthenticity to it because I was trying to do something that wasn't necessarily me, that wasn't necessarily the sorts of things that I love. On the social networks, you're absolutely right. Less is more unless it's honesty. The more honesty, the better. Anyone who follows me on Instagram or Twitter or Facebook or Litzy or Goodreads knows that I'm a novelist, and they can find out tons about my work on any of the online bookstores or Goodreads or NetGalley or Edelweiss or Penguin Random House. They don't need to learn about, or even my website, goodness gracious. They don't need to learn a whole lot about my books on the social networks. What they want on the social networks is me. And I don't mean narcissistic me. They want to know what interests me about either Vermont or Armenia, because those are my passions. What interests me about books or movies or television. So when I'm posting on Instagram or when I'm posting on Facebook, it's not about buy my book. Oh, certainly there will be posts about buy my book. Obviously, there will be some, but that can't be the lion's share of the posts. The lion's share of the posts have to be relevant and interesting images of the books that I love or the research that I did for a book, the kinds of things that they can't get elsewhere because I'm the only human being who can share it. I do all of my own social networking because if I want to quote about animal rights from Before You Know Kindness, I know the quote. If I want to talk about the links between the Armenian genocide and the Holocaust, as I've outlined them in the Sandcastle Girls, I know where to do that. If I want to talk about why Vermont is a breathtaking microcosm for the social issues confronting this country everywhere right now, I know what I want to say because I'm here.
You know, there's so many good, any brand listening could write their social media strategy based on the points that you just made. Authenticity, courage, relevant, interesting, but not about the product that you're trying to sell, if you will. Great, great points. Someone who has sold as many books as you have wouldn't have to be on social media. Your books would keep selling. Why invest the time there?
I have fun. The social networks are fun. I love reading other people's interesting posts or seeing other people's interesting photographs on Instagram. It wasn't all that long ago that my books sold briskly, but only among people with my last name. And I try never to lose sight of that fact. I get to do what I do because of my readers, which is a monumental blessing, and I try never to lose sight of that. And the great thing about the social networks is authors are no longer just photographs on the dust jacket of a book. we're real people. You see us in the supermarkets. You see us on the streets. You see us on Instagram. And it's fun.
There's so many. Again, I could sort of say these are really important points for brands to be thinking about it. But I have to quote Ben Franklin because what you just said is if you would be loved, be interested and interesting. And that's what, you're the interested part. You have fun on social. You enjoy that, but it also just shows you that, you can get beyond yourself as a writer and your books and enjoy, the time that you get to be with your fans. And that's such a healthy attitude. Do you allocate a specific amount of time to social media each day?
I don't. I know that in a perfect world, I will usually post on Facebook at least once a day, on Instagram at least once a day, and on Twitter, no fewer than, 7 or 8 tweets and no more than 7,500.
Do you have a favorite channel that you like when you're browsing that you enjoy more than another?
Do you mean for television?
No. I mean for social channels. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. I enjoy them all. I think it's really interesting as a novelist, though, to spend time on the social networks that are least likely to cause me angst. Here's the only downside to the social networks. In the months preceding the launch of any of my books, I have to be really careful when I'm on places like Goodreads because I don't want to see the reviews of the book from people who've gotten advance copies. That can A, absolutely destroy my confidence, and B, I don't want it to ever affect my writing. If somebody says, oh my gosh, he just cannot write women well, I don't want that in my head when I'm writing from a woman's perspective in whatever novel I currently have on my computer. So that's one important caveat. But other than that, if I see something beautiful when I'm riding my bike in Vermont, I'll stop and take a photograph. If I come across something lovely about Margaret Atwood or Jacqueline Woodson, I will certainly tweet it in a heartbeat.
And those are again. I think you could write the guide to how to be a writer on effective on social media. And I know you just sort of do it instinctually. But I'm gonna suggest it's in your DNA somehow. There's one funny thing. I was watching a TV show. I don't know if you've seen it, a series called The Killing, and in that TV show, there's another character, and that character is the rain of Seattle. I'm telling you, in every scene, it's unbelievable that it is raining. And it's funny because the characters don't even notice it. They don't even have their umbrellas up and they're getting soaking wet. And I think about that with your work. Vermont is another character, in a sense, in your work. And I think the fact that in social, you let the real Vermont shine through there's this wonderful connection between you and that state.
There is. And sometimes people say to me, the Vermont Department of Tourism must love you. And maybe they do, but sometimes I do remind those folks that I am also the writer who put a Vermont midwife on trial for manslaughter unfairly in the Northeast Kingdom, wrote an entire novel about Vermont's latent racism in The Buffalo Soldier, Vermont's dirty little secret domestic violence in Secrets of Eden, and how one public school teacher in Vermont was pilloried for falling in love with another human being transitioning in transistor radio. So I'm really not expecting a flower bouquet from the Department of Tourism anytime soon. But I do love this state. I mean, yes, it's imperfect, but goodness gracious, the world is pretty darn imperfect. And writers talk with an agonizing amount of hubris about where we found our voice. And the fact is, I know in my heart, I found my voice in the Green Mountains.
And I think it's an amazing voice. I have to say, I went through all of the 19 books that I could find listed on your Wikipedia page, and I realized that I've read 13 of them. So
wow, that's a lot. Thank you.
But there's a couple in there that I need to get back to. So I'm going to take a quick break here, and I'm going to go read one of Chris's books. Then I'm going to come back and I get a couple more questions. So hang with us. This is amazing, Chris. Thank you so much for spending this time. But we'll be right back.
So hi, Drew again. That was part one of a two-part interview that I did with novelist Chris Bohjalian. Like I said, our discussion went ranging from storytelling to marketing to how to really develop characters was so spot on and inspiring for marketers that we just kept talking. So stay tuned in just a couple of days for part two, and thanks as always for being a renegade thinker.
This has been Renegade Thinkers Unite, but it doesn't end there. Just go to renegadethinkersunite.com for more and subscribe to the show. That way, you'll never miss an episode. We'll talk with you next time on Renegade Thinkers Unite.